In the previous video, I completed my first pass through this section of the guide. And as I stated then, in this video, I'll now be starting my second pass through this guide. Most of the modifications were skipped on the first pass through this guide for two reasons. One was because the modification would be impacted by some future construction that needed to be done, and I needed that to be completed first before I could see how it would actually work on the prior modification. In essence, I was working from the bottom of the superstructure and going upwards, and in some cases, the components that sat lower down in the superstructure would be impacted by parts that sat above it. So obviously I would skip certain things to finalize the higher levels of the superstructure so that I could then come back and resolve those issues on the lower levels. There was also one modification that I had skipped for a different reason altogether, and that was simply that I didn't know what I needed to do to implement the modification. That's this first one. The addition of screens with large/rectangular openings through them on the Admiral's bridge. In the video where I asked for help with understanding what this requirement was, I was erroneously pointing to this area of the Admiral's bridge and thinking that there's some kind of structure that gets installed over here to close off this opening. That was completely wrong. Thankfully, this is a friendly and helpful community, and 3 viewers came forward to assist me with resolving this issue. 50-something bloke, bushranger, and Pennant 51. Pennant 51 is the author of this guide, so special thanks to him. All provided me with photos and drawings of this area of the ship so that I could understand what is meant by this text. Pennant 51 has also updated this guide to improve this text and provide drawings to explain exactly what is meant by the modifications to the screens in this area of the ship. This section of bulwark should not be a solid piece like this. It should have a frame that then contains sections of glass. What this means is that I need to cut out this section of plastic and construct a frame in its place. Unfortunately though, this is now all glued together, which is going to make this a little bit more difficult. If this lower part was still separate from this upper section, this would be considerably easier. I would be able to reach in here and cut this out. As it stands, I will not be able to separate these parts, so I'm going to have to cut this part in place. For the bottom edge, I think the best way to cut that is to use a saw. If I can come in cleanly from the side parallel to this ledge, I think I can cut a nice clean line all the way to this point. To cut from there up will be a bit of a challenge, so what I will do is drill a hole near the center of this and then try and cut it out, much in a similar way as I did for the triangular opening on the deck. As for the section at the top here, I think I will be able to snap that off because this was glued together. I won't be able to saw in there because of this overlap. But if need be, I can saw a bit lower and then file it back to create a clean finish. Let's give this a go. The first thing to do is to saw the base. I'm using the thicker of my saw blades to cut this section. That's because it's stiffer and I want to use the base of these bulkheads to guide the blade. The thickness isn't really a problem because, well, I'm removing the part of it in the center, so if it cuts out a larger notch, it doesn't really matter at all. The problem with this blade is that the teeth are quite large, and that makes it catch on the edge, so sawing isn't actually as easy as I would have liked it to be. If I'd used the thinner blade with much finer teeth, this would have gone a little bit easier. But this blade is working. Now that I've cut the bottom edge back to the corner, I can work on removing this section of plastic. On this side, just because of the twisting from the drill bit, it snaps off the section, so that's actually quite convenient and makes it a little bit easier to remove. On the other side, I guess I had glued it in place a little bit better and the drill bit makes it all the way through. Either way, it worked out well enough with drilling that hole. Now to try and open this up. Although on this side, because I wasn't able to drill all the way through with the larger drill bit, I do need to be a little bit more careful with getting the blade in place. But it cuts through easily enough. There's also a little bit of plastic attached to the ceiling that needs to be removed. This was just the guide for aligning the bulkheads. That's easy enough to just cut out with a blade, and then I'll sort it out with a file later on. But these edges do need to be cleaned up a bit more. I don't want to take off too much plastic now. I will try and bulk this up again later with super glue and of course a frame that's going to go into this location. On the other side, I'm able to break off the majority of this section of plastic by making a small cut at the top of the bulkhead, and then I cut out the rest of this section in much the same way as I did on the other side. You can see here that at the base of this section I did overcut it a little bit, and there's a notch that I'm going to need to fill. That shouldn't be too much of a problem. Now that the rough cut is complete, I can sort out the edges. All that requires is a little bit of filing and a few more tweaks with the blade. I then fill that notch that I cut using extra thick super glue. And once the glue is dried, I sand it smooth. Now that I have the openings, I know the dimensions of the frame that I need to construct. I'm going to construct the frame using 0.5 by 0.25 millimeter styrene stock, and I will construct the frame on the edge so that when you view it, you see the 0.25 millimeter edge. I want the frame to be as thin as possible. Even then, 0.25 millimeters is going to be out of scale. It's going to be too thick. But it will be a lot better than the blank wall that was there before. After measuring the length of the frame, I then cut out multiple sections of the same length using the chopper. I'm just cutting extras in case I make a mistake and I need to replace one of these pieces. It'll be difficult for me to exactly reset up the chopper in this configuration, so I might as well just cut extra pieces now, and then if there's a mistake, just use them instead of trying to reconfigure it like this. After cutting the sides, I cut sections for the height of the frame. The idea is to construct the perimeter of the frame first, and then put in the internal sections after I'm happy with the shape of the external perimeter of the frame. Once I've created the perimeter of the frame, I'll be able to test fit it on the model, and then I can know that when I install the internal sections that it will not be a waste of time because it will still fit. This is delicate work, but surprisingly not that difficult. Here I think the hero tool are locking tweezers, just to be able to hold one of the edges of the frame in place while I glue them together. I'm gluing the sections of plastic stock together using Revell Contactor Professional. It's quite a thick plastic cement. After the glue has tacked some of the components together, I release it from the locking tweezers and place it on the cutting mat. I then push down gently on the frame to ensure that all the components are level. I then repeat the process for the second frame, and then return to the first frame. At this point, the base edge and the side edges are sufficiently glued together. The glue isn't fully set, so they can move a bit, but it's enough for me to be able to manipulate it and install the top section without me worrying about the frame falling apart. So I gently lower the top section onto the frame, manipulate it on the mat to ensure that it is stuck together at the edges to form proper corners. At this point, the frames are flat but not exactly square, so I place the components onto the chopper and use the square to ensure that the corners are 90 degrees. At this point, the frames are still quite delicate. The glue hasn't fully set and I don't want to knock it out of alignment, so I leave them to dry for a while before I start installing the internal sections of the frame. Once the glue has sufficiently dried, I install a horizontal section. This section divides the larger bottom part of the opening from a smaller top part. It just required a slight trimming to get it to the correct length. These were initially cut at the same length as the bottom and top sections of the frame. I'm not using the chopper to make this adjustment. I'm just doing it by eye and cutting it with my hobby knife. It's quite easy to take off very small sections of plastic using a hobby knife. Once it's the right length and inserting it between the posts of the frame doesn't cause the frame to bow, I then glue it in place using Revell Contactor Professional. I now need to install a vertical post. This divides the frame in half. I follow the same process. I cut sections of plastic stock until they are the right length, essentially until they stop causing the frame to bow. I then glue the sections in place using Revell Contactor Professional. After giving the frames a good while to dry, they can be fitted onto the superstructure. I'm gluing them in place using Revell Contactor Professional, at least initially, to tack them in place. The fit is tight, which is good because it's supposed to be tight. It's supposed to fit precisely in this gap. I'm quite happy with that, and it seems to be able to fit in there nice and squarely. Once I have the frame properly positioned, I reinforce the bonds using extra thin plastic cement. I repeat the process for the other side. This side, it's a bit looser. There's a slightly larger gap at the bottom. I was a bit overzealous there. So once again, I use Revell Contactor Professional to tack it in place, and then I reinforce the bond using Tamiya extra thin plastic cement. On the port side, the gap below the window frame needs a bit of attention. I initially fill it using Revell Contactor Professional, and once the glue has dried, I cover it with plastic putty. A little bit of putty is also required on the starboard side, but not nearly as much. Once the putty has dried, I remove the excess with a file, and then I spray the surface with Mr. Surfacer 500. This will fill micro scratches and help reveal any defects that I can then fix. Some minor touch-ups were required, but in general I was very happy with the finish. Once the surfacer has dried, I then paint the frames in XF53. This is the color that I'm using for Hood's superstructure. Hopefully this is a better representation of this area of the ship. I know it isn't perfect. There's a matter of scale here, where it becomes very difficult to build it exactly as it was, but it should look a lot closer to reality than what was provided with the kit. In the next video, I will construct the Admiral's chart house. That goes inside this area of the superstructure. It's a detail that is completely missing from this model. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.